Let's look at y equal to cosine x and some of its variations. Let's start with y equal to a cosine x. What happens if I multiply cosine of x by a number? Here I have my graph of cosine x and I want to change the value of a. If a is bigger than 1, we can see that it's going to stretch the graph vertically. If it's between 0 and 1, it's going to shrink it vertically. And a negative is going to flip it across the x-axis in either stretch or shrink, depending on if that negative is bigger or smaller than -1. So this value of a in front of a cosine is going to change how tall the peaks are. We call the absolute value of a the amplitude, and the amplitude does affect the range of the function. Instead of being between 1 and -1, y is between negative absolute value of a and absolute value of a. Next, let's see what happens when I multiply x by a number. Instead of evaluating cosine and then multiplying, what happens if I multiply the angle by a number before I evaluate the cosine? And for this, I'm specifically going to want b to be greater than 0. I want to be multiplying by a positive number. As I change the value of b, what I'm doing is I'm changing how often my graph repeats. I'm changing how many times I see my peaks and my troughs within a given time period. So I'm just changing the frequency. I'm changing how often we have our peaks and our troughs. In this case, instead of having a period of 2 pi, we have a period of 2 pi over b, since the b does affect how often I see this function repeat. Next, let's see what we get when we do a cosine bx minus c. What happens if I subtract something from the angle x before I take the cosine? So if I change the value of c, if I add or subtract a number, it's going to shift this graph either right or left, depending on what I'm subtracting. If I'm subtracting a positive number, it shifts it to the right. If I'm subtracting a negative number, it shifts it to the left. The value of c over b is known as the phase shift. It tells me how far I'm going to be moving, left or right. Finally, let's look at what happens when we add a number to the end. Instead of adding the number and then evaluating cosine, let's see what happens after we evaluate cosine and then add the number. In this case, if I'm adding a number to the end or subtracting a number from the end, it's going to indicate this vertical shift. The graph is going to either move up or down, depending on if I'm adding a positive or a negative number. This value of d is known as the vertical shift, and it does affect the range of the function. D minus the absolute value of a is less than or equal to y, is less than or equal to d plus the absolute value of a. So instead of being between -1 and 1, we're between d plus or minus the absolute value of a.